Hello, welcome to History 102 Test 2 review. We're going to go over the Test 2 questions to give you some guidance. Question number 1, pick 3 items from Russell Kirk's definition of conservatism and then describe and analyze the concepts. So I shared a video with you in the week's modules, one of my YouTube videos on Russell Kirk's definition of conservatism. What you'll do is you'll watch the video. There's 12 items. You'll pick 3 of those, 3 of your favorites that you want to talk about. You can analyze them, give your point of view, perspective, give examples, compare and contrast. If you remember, previously we had gone over progressivism as an ideology. So you can compare and contrast those points of view and how they affect American politics today. The second question, compare and contrast Martin Luther King and Malcolm X's approach to ending segregation. You have the lecture I gave you. I had an audio lecture. You've had a life. You've been to the American public. You've been through the American public education system. You've had a lifetime of reading and watching Martin Luther King speeches and documentaries. You might be less familiar with Malcolm X. However, so in your the second writing assignment option, you had one of the videos was a Malcolm X speech. Another one was a Martin Luther King interview. And so as you studied Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, I'd like you to compare and contrast their different approaches to ending segregation in the United States during their lifetime. And so you'll look at kind of your perspective on them, how they're viewed today, even. Um, you know, uh, Martin Luther King's views how are they viewed today? Malcolm X, and kind of give your point of view on that as well. The third question, analyze the counterculture of the 1960s. I gave you several writing prompts to help you, uh, just kind of help you kind of decide what to write about. I'll always get emails about, I don't know what to write about. So I gave you a few writing prompts to kind of look at, to see, to give you some ideas of what you can talk about. The counterculture of the 60s. You can talk about rock and roll, anti-war movement, drug culture, hippies. You know, there's all kinds of the rights movements of the 1960s, civil rights, feminists, even gay rights was a part of that as well. So you can look at all the different rights movements of the era, the free speech movement, Berkeley University, kind of look at and analyze kind of why this counterculture started, what got it going, what kept it going, why was this younger generation um, critiquing or rebelling against the older generation of the time period, and also critiquing the prevailing liberal internationalism uh, that had been pretty predominant in American politics since the 1930s through the 60s. You also want to talk about the New Left. We talked about that in uh, the Vietnam War lecture and the 60s lecture. I bring up this idea, this concept of the New Left. You had um, people who, like liberals became the conservatives kind of thing. As people, as some went so progressive or left that, they started looking up to Mao and Stalin, mass murderers like Mao and Stalin, and became much more authoritarian, much more statist, much more totalitarian in their views as well. And so you can look at that as well. This is a big question. Trace the development of the Vietnam War from 1945 onward. Um, my Vietnam War lecture is pretty long. You had the audio lecture, and so Vietnam War is such a massive topic. And so what you want to do is just kind of narrow it down to talk about some specific things. For example, some students answer this question by just going through each president of the era and how we dealt with Vietnam with them. For example, as you saw in the lecture, uh, Harry Truman, with Harry Truman, uh, financial aid to the French, so that you know they could get Indochina back, get French Indochina back. Under Eisenhower, you had nation building. Under Eisenhower, the Republic of South Vietnam was created, and so you have an era of nation building. We're actually creating a country there. With Kennedy, you saw advisors. As Kennedy tried to negotiate or balance between further involvement in Vietnam or pulling out or kind of pulling back. Johnson is obviously the big topic of the era. This is the era where we had combat, 534,000 combat troops. And then you go with Nixon, that's Vietnamization, and then Ford. The Ford administration's hands are tied, right? When North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam in 1975, there's not much the Ford administration can do other than help get people out of Vietnam who want to not don't want to live in the don't want to live in the joys of the workers' paradise, you know. So and ideology so great, people fight to get on helicopters to get out. And so anyways, so kind of you can trace that. That's one way you can do it. You can put it in the Cold War context, how Vietnam fit into the overall Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The next question, Watergate, its place in American history. Describe what you trace the scandal. What were the parts of it? Um, you want to talk about Nixon's psychology. Historians, with Richard Nixon, historians almost become psychologists. Historians are fascinated with Richard Nixon as a political figure. And so, uh, a lot of Watergate, for a lot of historians, Watergate is understood in the context of Nixon's psychology, him as a person, his personality. So you look at that, look at his White House aides who developed the committee to reelect the president, uh, and engaged in various activities. You can look at, some students 50 years on, some students go, what was really the crime? What, what's the difference between just, politics, and actual, criminal behavior? Some students wonder, was this just Democrats going after a Republican president they didn't like? And to some extent, that's true. And so you can look at the political battle. Richard Nixon had just won a 49 state landslide victory in 1972. And, so of course, Democrats are hopping at the chance to go after a Republican president that slaughtered him. And so you can look at that. Some students like to look at the political aspects of it. Um, and and so there's all kinds of things you can look at with the Watergate scandal, and also its place in American history. When you talk to people, what's interesting when you talk to people who remember Watergate, who were there, so to speak, it's pretty emotional for them. I had a story one time for a history club. I invited another history teacher to come share some like old newspapers they had and stuff, and they started talking about Watergate. And this history teacher he was an adult working in Washington D.C. during Watergate, and This was about 10 years ago, so about 2014, about 10 years ago. He was talking. He When he started talking about Nixon and Watergate, he he was talking about it like it was going on right that minute. I mean, he became emotional. I mean, he was flipping out. He became so emotional and upset, and like I was like, it's okay, it's okay. You know, I mean, he just became like unglued, like as if Watergate was happening right that second. I mean, you know, so what is that? So you can talk about that. Like, what is events that make you so emotional? Like for the people that remember 9/11, that's an emotional event. Uh, you know, I was obviously alive during 9/11. It's an emotional event, right? But you talk to younger people who it if you're younger than 24, you know 9/11 is a history event, right? And so kind of deal that how do we live through things and they're so emotional, we flip out. What does time do? You know, for example, I was born during Watergate. What was going on? But I was a baby. I don't remember it. But to me, it's a historical event. You know, you study it. I learned about Watergate the same thing, the same way you students did in school. You know, so you can kind of deal with that. The Iran-Contra scandal. So I had the lecture on that, the 80s, the YouTube videos, the 80s, and whatever the Iran-Contra scandal. I believe I mentioned in the videos if the Iran-Contra scandal is not your favorite scandal of all time, then I did not do my job. Fantastic. The best presidential scandal in U.S. history. So, describe it. What were the parts to it? What were the motivations for it? Why is the Reagan administration concerned, about hostages in Lebanon and Contras in Nicaragua, and how are they connecting them to? Uh, you can look at, how with Watergate and Iran Contra, you can look at the role of advisors, right? With Nixon, his advisors were doing a lot of the work. With Reagan, his advisors were doing all this work. These scandals, in a lot of ways, are Watergate and Iran Contra. These scandals are almost like aides. White House aides are doing the scandal. The presidents are just sitting there. Um, and so, you can kind of talk about that. What's the difference between Reagan and Nixon? Why did Nixon get in trouble? Reagan gets out of Iran Contra largely unscathed. So you can analyze that. I did a YouTube video on this, described two places where the Cold War ended peacefully and two places it ended violently. So make sure you watch the YouTube video or both of those. I go into detail on those. Just talk about it, how they ended peacefully, and then how they violently. You can compare and contrast. What was the difference? Why did they end peacefully in Poland and Czechoslovakia? Why did it get violent in Romania and Hungary? Romania, Yugoslavia, a little bit in Hungary, but mainly Romania and Yugoslavia. At some point, where in Yugoslavia, you had a several year war between the Serbs and every other group in Yugoslavia. Um, for this next question, I wanted to kind of go back to this idea of nostalgia when we talked about the 1950s. For baby boomers, the 50s are nostalgic. For Gen Xers, the 80s are that nostalgic decade where everything was perfect and wonderful. And what's the attraction of that? It's the attraction of previous eras. We want to kind of go back to a better era. And then when you study history, how does studying history inform your perspective of the past? Does it um, destroy nostalgia? Does it help it? Does it put the past in perspective? So, and this last question, one reason why a lot of students think history is boring or history is not relevant to them is they don't think about their place in history. And so I kind of want you to think about like your place in history, historical events you remember. And so I gave you some examples. They can talk about first current president you remember when you were young. Funny story. I I asked one semester one student she put George Washington. George Washington was the first president I remember, and and I was like, you unless you're 250 years old, you don't remember George Washington. I mean, the first president you remember currently in your life. For example, for me, it was Ronald Reagan. So, kind of, or to think about like when you were probably 8 to 10. Think about when you were. Think about generally when people are about 8 years old is when they kind of start paying attention to the world at large. So think about think about when you were about the 8-year-old to 10-year-old range. You know, so for me that would have been 1981 to 83. You know, and so so like Ronald Reagan was president. The first Super Bowl I remember is the Oakland Raiders uh, and the Philadelphia Eagles. Yes, both were good back then. The Oakland Raiders won first World Series. I remember the Dodgers and Yankees, 1981. The Yankees won. No, the Dodgers won. It was the last World Series the Yankees were going to be in until like 1996. So kind of what are some things you remember? And it could be fun stuff, like what I just said. My first Super Bowl I remember was the Oakland Raiders versus Philadelphia Eagles. I remember that one. First World Series I remember watching where it was the '81, it was the Dodger Yankee series. So think about fun stuff like that. You talk about world events. Like the first world event I remember kind of watching was Iran hostages coming home, um, January 1981. Um, I remember President Reagan being shot. I remember coming home from school, and I was wanting to watch afternoon TV. Coming home from school, and I couldn't watch TV. Mom wanted to watch the news. President Reagan had been shot. Um, so kind of think about that, and so for example, so if you're 18 right now in 2024, so 2014 you were 8, so 2014 would be Obama, right? So Obama is probably for kind of the 18-year-old range. Obama might be the first president you remember. Uh, anyways, so kind of talk about that, and maybe talk about how nostalgia might impact you. Like, do you have a nostalgic era? Were the early 2000s, you know, uh, great. For millennials, the 90s. For millennials, the 90s, kind of their growing up years. For millennials, the 90s were kind of the nostalgic decade. And so anyways, so kind of look at that. Remember, remember minimum answers are 250 words. You don't have to take the test all at once. Um, and so good luck with everything, and email me if you have any questions.